there's all these stories about, guys over in Macedonia who are running these fake news sites.
Number 24 is Content Farms in Macedonia.
Бидејќи ако се направи грешка, таа ќе биде кобна. Нема враќање назад.
So Europe need to remain more sexy lady in the world. Ајде, мајката!
Господа ја чува Македонија и низините граѓани.
The Bulgarian government, led by President Rumen Radev, but supported by several of the more rabid parties in parliament, continue their war on Macedonia by insisting that a veto on Macedonia's start of EU accession talks will continue next month unless the Macedonian government and Macedonians agree to their childish demands that Macedonians essentially commit identity suicide. Back in Macedonia, the ever-unhelpful party of former terrorist-turned politician gangster Ali Ahmeti, Dewey, formerly the National Liberation Army, unveiled a very tall monument in Slupčane to former fighters in that so-called National Liberation Army with a very large double-headed eagle on the top for all to see from miles, or in Macedonia's case, kilometers around. All the while claiming that this new monument will help bring Macedonians and Albanians together. Oh, it was built illegally, but again, Ahmeti is a modern-day gangster. And the largest political party in Macedonia, VMRO-DPMNE, has announced that they will begin boycotting Parliament unless early elections are held. We'll discuss all of this and more on this episode of the Macedonian Content Farmers Podcast. I'm Jason Miko, coming to you from the foot of the Catalina Mountains in Oro Valley, Arizona.
And this is Cvetin in Skopje, Macedonia.
How you doing, Cvetin?
Good. Haven't done a podcast in a while, so it's time to reintroduce ourselves to the audience.
Last one was like middle of April. Today is May 8th, Sunday. We're recording this. Happy Mother's Day to those listening from the United States. I'm not sure how many other countries around the world celebrate Mother's Day in the fashion that we do. I know I was talking to one of my Estonian friends the other day, and they actually have taken a hold of this American holiday, and they celebrate it as well today. I know that March 8 is, March 8 is Women's Day. Right.
Yeah, we stick to that one.
Mm.
Like
well, happy Mother's Day to all the mothers out there anyway. So,
yeah.
So yeah, we've been gone for about 3 weeks. We've got a lot to talk about. I wanted to start today with our we're contractually obligated to talk about Bulgaria in every podcast.
Might as well get it out of the way.
Exactly. So back in March, the government of Macedonia and the government of Bulgaria hailed the warming of relations between Macedonia and Bulgaria by introducing a new flight between Sofia and Skopje from the Bulgarian airline Gulliver Air. And they said, this is proof positive that our nations are coming together, that we are one, or whatever it is they said, etc., blah, blah, blah. Of course, it was basically put into place by the governments. It wasn't market-driven. There was no demand. And one of the websites that I follow that kind of follows air travel in the former Yugoslavia announced that it's XU Aviation is the website. They announced that the flight between Sofia and Skopje is no more as of May 21. So the flights were carrying about 7 or 8 passengers, and according to this website, sometimes there were only 2 or 3 people on board, less than the number of crew members on the flight. So, there was no demand. People didn't want it. They either drive or they don't go or whatever. So, but this is just an example, I think. It's a good example of foolish politicians that try and force things that the people don't want.
Yeah, I had a look at the flight, and it was not very convenient. I think the problem was you either stay there for the whole work week or just the weekend when you can't get any job. It was either too much or too short a time and you couldn't get anything done. I'm not really sure. I think that was the flight I was looking at, but I had a look. I thought about it. I use it. I go there sometimes, but it was not very convenient. And then a Bulgarian TV station did a report on this, and as you said, they had like 7 or 8 people on the flight. It took more, and it was significantly more expensive than driving, even though the The road is horrible, so
Yeah.
that's one, advantage. But it was slower if you consider all the, the logistics of getting to the airport, and was way more expensive if you have several people traveling. If it's just you, then okay, then it might be comparably priced to driving. But if it's two of you, then it made no sense.
Exactly. So again, an example of governments forcing things on the public that they don't want, and of course, the government hailed this as a major event for Macedonia and Bulgaria. Didn't happen. Moving on. So last week, today I mentioned is May 8. Last week, May 4, we celebrated remembered observance the death of Goce Delchev, Macedonian hero. Interesting aside, May the 4th, of course, is known as Star Wars Day around the world. May the 4th be with you. May the Force be with you. And of course, that original Star Wars, released in 1977, have to get in our pop culture references. It's been a while. That original Star Wars was retitled, when they did the prequels, A New Hope. And I was thinking, I got to write an article on this, Cvetin, because, that's the day that we honor Goce Delchev, and it's a new hope. And I can't stress this enough. There is hope for Macedonia. We just got to focus on it. Anyway, I'll work on that theme and come up with something. But on the anniversary, President Rumen Radev of Bulgaria, again, basically stated that he's going to keep, vetoing Macedonia's start to EU accession talks. And he's got a number of, he's the president, but there's a number of parties in the current government led by Kirill Petkov, who seems a little more moderate in his stance. But these parties are going to bring Kirill down if he agrees to open talks. If he doesn't agree with Rumen Radev and the others, that the veto has to continue. And I see the EU politicians are running around, the U.S. ambassadors running around saying, you gotta let the Macedonians start these talks. If you were a betting man, I'm a betting man. If you were a betting man, what would you say is going to happen in June?
Oh, I'd say 50-50, because it's possible that many in Bulgaria are accepting now that we postpone the conditioning, so that we only assume an obligation. Kovachevsky assumes an obligation to amend the constitution and make other concessions, then have but not actually deliver them in time for June, which is too short.
Yeah.
And he does not have the votes to amend the constitution, and then put this before the EU, and then the EU somehow serves as a guarantor of that any subsequent government will will accept the same concessions, and then that Bulgaria would lift the veto. So this is accepted by a number of people in Bulgaria, and Kovachevsky is publicly and openly saying he wants to open the accession talks, but he has these two coalition partners, the Bulgarian Socialist Party and the ITN party of that showman Rumen Radev, and Radev has the foreign ministry, so they're openly feuding, the foreign minister Genchovska and Petkov, over the issue. So now Petkov is due to travel to Washington, and he's not taking Genchovska, he's taking the deputy foreign minister, which is notable. He's taking the people in charge of energy, so they're going to discuss, gas and how badly we're going to all freeze this winter, and they're going to discuss Macedonia without the hardliners, but, can they do anything without the hardliners who can bring down the government? That's a big question. And then they created this huge target for our people, anybody on our side who wants to break up the accession talks, the negotiations, when they inaugurated this club in Bitola. It still hasn't been touched, but at any moment from now until June, if somebody so much as breaks a window, and it is in an unfriendly territory. Bitola has never been a city known for, any friendship toward Bulgaria, and it had, a lot of Holocaust. It was one of the centers of the Holocaust. So it's very easy now for the Petkov practically gave a huge gift to anybody who wants to cause trouble to break the negotiations. It's just like when the left wanted to create problems for Gruevski, so they opened a gay club in the Skopje Old Bazaar, which is heavily Albanian, heavily Muslim, and they would do parties in an area which I wouldn't be very comfortable moving around at night. And they were having a gay party there. I mean, that's, and obviously they got, people were throwing rocks at them a couple of times, shouting at them all the time, Albanians. And then they would just turn around after every incident in a coordinated fashion with the embassies, with everybody, and they would accuse Gruevski of a climate of hostility toward the gays. They would point out to conservative Macedonian commentators as allegedly steering this in part of the city where nobody listens to conservative Macedonian commentators. So this is now the same thing practically. The Bulgarians laid the bait, and if somebody takes it, they will have a solid excuse to not allow us to open accession talks.
Right. And of course, you refer to the Vancho Mihailov club in Bitola. Yeah. So I think that the veto will remain. Of course, the issue is, as we've talked about and written about many times before, is that the Bulgarians will continue to add conditions. There's 32 chapters to the acquis, if that's how you pronounce it. The whole framework that each country that wants to join the EU has to align its own laws with, and there's the opening of the chapter, the negotiation of the chapter, the closing of the chapter, and Bulgaria can veto at any one of those. Well, if there's 30 chapters, that's 90 times. Not to mention something we haven't talked about in a while, the Greeks. They could do the same thing, and I know that they're pretty quiet right now, but there's all kinds of issues just bubbling under the surface where they could do the same thing, and they will. They will, because the issue is not. The issue is denying Macedonians their identity, their name, their culture, their language, their church, which we can talk about a little bit later, and many other things. So, anyway, we'll revisit that. I mentioned in the monologue this very, very large monument. I don't know how many meters it is. I saw something like 20 meters.
20, yeah.
20 meters. Okay, so that's 65 feet. It's a good size. Good size. It's a vertical, basically, tower with a large double-headed eagle on the top, and apparently you can go up into the tower, and there's a platform up there to stand on. And there was there's a picture of Ali Ahmeti and the Dewey leaders at the top there unfurling a very large Albanian flag, and of course this is to a monument, quote unquote, to the so-called national liberation fighters that died in the 2001 war in Macedonia that Ali Ahmeti started. I asked a friend of mine last time I was in Macedonia, who used to be a member of the Special Forces, how many of Macedonia's ethnic Albanians were killed in that war, and he said nobody knows, but the number's in the thousands. Yeah. And to me, it's always been, just looking at this from the standpoint of Macedonia's ethnic Albanians, these young kids, 18, 19 years old, that joined a movement to create an independent state out of Macedonia, which is what Ali Ahmeti's original goal was. And follow this Pied Piper, Ali Ahmeti, to their deaths. And it's always struck me that the ethnic Albanians in Macedonia just don't seem to have cared much about their kin and kith, these kids that died. Brothers and sons and nephews and uncles, and it's just strange that doesn't seem to be a concern of theirs. Anyway. Maybe that's the way they are as a people. They don't care about their own. Anyway, but this thing is a monument. Of course, it was built illegally, but not that will ever bring it down. And Slupčani is near Kumanovo.
Kumanovo and the border with Serbia.
Right, and
it's one of the migrant villages where the migrants sleep over before moving on toward Berlin.
Berlin and Sweden.
And Munich.
Munich, yeah, Sweden, other places, yeah, exactly. This is obviously a provocation. They did this on purpose. It'll never be torn down. It'll never be brought down. Of course, these monuments have been going up all over the country, all over the ethnic Albanian parts of the country for years. I saw the mayor of Kumanovo, Maxim
Dimitrievski.
Okay, yeah. He said he wanted to build a monument to the Macedonian defenders. Is that going to happen?
Yeah, I'm pretty sure, but then it's probably going to get vandalized more because Albanians often vandalize monuments to Macedonian soldiers from 2001, while their monuments are often, in
Off limits.
parts of the country where Macedonians don't actually go, so they are safer.
Yeah. Well, that's too bad. It does nothing to bring Macedonians and Albanians, let alone anybody else together. I always find it fascinating that the ethnic Albanian leaders in Macedonia always talk about how victimized they are and about their rights, but they never talk about there are other ethnicities that live in Macedonia that are proudly, loyally Macedonian.
It implies we might be having elections soon because, Dewey usually does these kinds of things when it's election time to boost their, humiliating their Macedonian coalition partner with these displays of nationalism, but also that they're bigger Albanians than the other Albanian parties. And we have open discussion about holding early elections. VMRO demands this. So it could be indicative of
that's
moving in this direction.
Yeah, and that's a good segue. So, yeah, as I mentioned in the monologue, VMRO wants to, we'll start boycotting Parliament unless Kovačevski agrees to talk to Miskolski about early elections and other issues facing Macedonia. I don't know if he's going to do that, but you mentioned the elections. In a recent poll, I found this fascinating. Citizens asked to name the politician they trust the most. Ali Ahmeti came in fourth with 7.3%. And below him, Zoran Zaev, 6.4%. Miskolski leads with 16.2, Kovačevski at 8.7. No surprise there. And then just on the party level, VMRO is at 21.2, and Citizen is, or Citizen, as we say, we could drop off the M, 16.2. Good numbers. I'd rather see VMRO with a 42 as opposed to 21, double that. Is what you really need, because again, these polls show that every time one of these polls is done, it basically shows that half the citizens have no idea what they'll do or they won't say, etc. But VMRO's got to have an overwhelming lead in these polls in order to, if elections are held, then to have any chance of overturning any of these disastrous decisions that the Kovačevski government and the Zaev government have implemented or will implement.
Yeah, it's not a huge difference, and if you consider that, if Dewey sticks with SDSM, they could still, form another government if they continue picking the weaker Macedonian party. Of course, if SDSM is, their number of seats is, comparable to that of VMRO. Even with these numbers, they can lose a significant margin in parliament when the parliament is formed. But first of all, we have to get to the elections. VMRO is now going to begin blocking any legislation in parliament starting on Tuesday until, and you can do this by talking too long during the debate or by
filibuster.
Yeah, just handing thousands of amendments which you cannot realistically go through on each proposed law. And they say they're going to do this until SDSM agrees to hold early elections, and then VMRO is going to propose some term in autumn. SDSM insists that the elections will take place in 2024, but they might move it in the spring, by a few months forward, and call it early elections. So they're probably going to try to compromise on 2023 if, the VMRO blockade really begins to bite. We'll see. But this is going to start next week. So far, VMRO have not been... they announced they're going to do protests and more action. As really, the economic situation is horrible. with inflation and shortages actually of food and energy. So VMRO initially said we're going to hold off on protests because of Ukraine. We don't want to cause more trouble. But now that Ukraine is largely settled into a front line, VMRO supported the strike of the public sector teachers in lieu of their own actual protests. And now they say, okay, we're going to ramp up, we're going to do something even more. We're going to block the parliament, and yeah, we'll see if, it depends on whether we get a date for accession talks, if Kovacevsky signs something with the Bulgarians, and how horrible it's going to be, how badly it's going to hurt his own party, where, a lot of people are still hostile to, were historically very hostile to Bulgaria and are not very happy to see any concession made to the Bulgarians. So yeah, it's going to depend on a few factors, but if things go badly for the government, they could go badly real quick.
Interesting. You mentioned the inflation, obviously the economy, which is in horrible shape. There's inflation, of course, rampant throughout the world. My bacon is double the price, almost double the price of what I used to pay for it, which I can't stand because I love bacon. But you had joked in our in our emails back and forth before this podcast that the next time I come there, I should bring cooking oil, and we can barter for it. Is it that bad?
For bacon? Yeah, I mean, it's not only gotten more expensive, but because of the stupid system of limiting the profit margin the supermarket can charge on it, they're practically keeping it in the warehouse. So then the government, like in the good old days of communism, of controlled market, fixed prices, the government then has to send inspectors to the warehouses to search, to look for cooking oil, and then shame or threaten the company to put it into circulation. There is often a situation that we don't really have cooking oil in the supermarket.
Wow. Yeah.
Yeah.
Here we thought that communism had long been discredited and was in the dustbin of history, etc. But it seems that it's irresistible to a political party that before 1991 called itself the League of Communists of Macedonia, which of course is Sitasa and Zoran Zaev and Dimitar Kovacevsky. You mentioned the Ukraine. Let's just tiptoe really quickly there on the issue that, so tomorrow's May 9, which is a victory day for Russia over the Nazis. And who knows what's going to happen on the fighting front. But longer term, setting aside the fighting, of course, Ukraine is a breadbasket. Russia and Ukraine, I think, produce half the world's wheat, and I think Ukraine produces, I don't know how much of the cooking oil, 80% of the world's cooking oil. And then there's the fertilizer issue that both countries produce. And then you have, at least in Ukraine, farmers aren't able to go out and plant. They weren't able to go out and plant this spring. Anyway, all that to say, there's a coming food crisis, not just for countries like the United States and Macedonia, but it will impact more negatively Africa and the Middle East and places like that. And we know what happens when in especially places like the Middle East there are hungry, upset people. So we all have that to look forward to. All right, let's see. You mentioned the church, or I mentioned the church earlier. Let's talk a little bit about that, because you, again, on our back and forth on email before the podcast, you mentioned that's an issue, and I don't fully understand it, even though I am actually Macedonian Orthodox. I try not to get involved in the political issues. I just preach Jesus Christ, born of a virgin, lived, crucified, rose on the third day, coming again to judge the quick and the dead. But what's going on with that? Inform our listeners.
Yeah. So there is now an announcement from the Serbian church that they have resumed negotiations with Macedonia. So practically, Serbia is blocking the wider acceptance of the Macedonian church in the brotherhood, a very feuding brotherhood of Orthodox churches at the moment. And then at the same time, so their proposal is that we accept that we illegally seceded from the Serbian church in the 60s, that we go back, and they say at least for a minute, and then we're going to hold a new service, and we're going to release you. Promise, trust us. We're going to release you into a fully independent church, but first you have to come back. Okay, we don't really very much trust them on this, but fine. And then the U.S. Is pushing, especially the outgoing ambassador to Greece, is pushing something similar to what the U.S. did for the Ukrainian church, which split from the Russian church with the help of Bartholomew, the patriarch of Constantinople, the Greek ecumenical patriarch, who is supposed to be like the first among equals
yes.
in the Orthodox Dome. So he recognized the Ukrainian church. Russia broke relations with Constantinople, got very angry at them. The US was openly involved in this. So now they're working with the Greeks to do the same for us. This would annoy the Serbs, who the Greeks are very friendly to. So the Greeks are not eager to do this, even for a bribe, even for anything. Then they're also not eager to have our church made independent, because this would mean it would have the name Macedonia in it, so maybe they would ask us to use some form, either not be a full independent church, maybe under some the Greek church or the ecumenical church, maybe called just the Ohrid Archbishopry and not a Macedonian church. Zaev had a side quest. He tried to get the Bulgarian church to our church practically asked the Bulgarian church to accept us as their daughter church. Like, I don't know what they were thinking with this. And then that they release us, so like practically bypass the Serbs in some fashion. And the Bulgarians refused, even though this would have been a huge coup for them, that we accept their seniority in religious matters, while feuding over the language, identity, history. This would have been a huge deal for them, but they refused because they sensed that the Americans are behind this, helping Zaev, and practically the pro-Russian bishops in Sofia refused. So they had a vote and they were split with slight majority against the proposal. So it's, I don't know, the US ambassador is now tweeting about our church, our religious identity, how we need to have it preserved. After completely driving a truck through our identity back and forth several times, now she's talking about our identity. So I sense that the US is trying to reinforce us in this fashion, like a split with Serbia and Russia, a pro-Western identity in some segment, because they practically have the left under their thumb. The left will go with whoever is stronger at the moment. They have the Albanians at the moment. The Albanians obviously go with whoever is stronger, but the US does not has very little influence over the conservative, the proper, the normals, the Macedonian Orthodox population. Outside of the elite, the urban centers, they're really hated at the moment. They have some bribed VMRO people on their payroll, but they don't really have much influence. So I guess they want to have something like, okay, we did something for you, we helped recognize your church, look, this is the benefits of being our ally, but you need to have this identity, which we are now maybe reinforcing, to have it anti-Russian. And apparently Serbia is now trying to counter this by this newest proposal on the church, that we don't gain our independence through the Constantinople American route, or through the Bulgarian route, but back through the Serbian route, that they somehow catch and then release us.
Right. Interesting. Okay, I'm gonna leave that one aside for right now, and kind of explore it a little bit more. But on that subject of, let's talk just briefly about identity. I did notice back in April, I think this was after our last podcast, there was a list released from NATO of the two-letter codes that NATO uses to recognize the various countries in NATO. And for Macedonia, NATO's using NM, which one of our mutual friends on Twitter joked that I've seen my country go from the former Yugoslav Republic of Macedonia to North Macedonia to now New Mexico, and being the designation for New Mexico here in America. So and whereas the proper, at least according to the so-called Prespa agreement, should be MK or MKD as official abbreviations, with the exceptions, I guess, of the license plates on vehicles, which is NM. That's part of the so-called Prespa agreement. And another Twitter user said, well, Albania is AL, Bulgaria is BU, so that follows the first two letters of the single name of the state, or UK for United Kingdom, US for United States. But when you look at the Czech Republic, it's CZ, not CR. So, and Slovakia and Slovenia, which both start with SL or SK and SN, understandably, not SNL though. That's Saturday Night Live. So my point being that, there's some flexibility here that NATO has. It doesn't follow this rule entirely. It could easily adopt MK, which would be entirely in line with everything. But I believe that they did this on purpose, for a variety of reasons. One is probably pressure from the Greeks, of course, within NATO itself. But, again, I think it's still part of going back to the identity issue. I still believe that a lot of these institutions and the individuals that are part of these institutions, whether it's the U.S. ambassador or the NATO Secretary General, are loath to use the adjective Macedonian or Macedonians or MK for a whole variety of reasons. And some malicious, some just they're not being very thoughtful. But what all of this does to do is serves to, at an international level, try and weaken Macedonia's identity. At the same time, though, and I find this interesting, what it also does, it weakens the trust that Macedonians themselves have in these institutions, which is not good for the institutions, or for Macedonians, or for Macedonia. And I'm not entirely sure. I don't think that these organizations, these institutions, and the people that run them understand that, or if they do, maybe they don't care. I don't know. But yeah, go ahead.
I mean, now we allegedly are a full member of NATO and have veto power, so we can't say anymore that they're doing it to us. Now we are doing it to us. This is something we can block. We can actually block movement that is important to Bulgaria on Ukraine, maybe some deployment, or we can actually block something significant on Ukraine until and demand that Bulgaria lifts its veto for our EU membership. I mean, we were told that once we become a NATO member, that we are a full-fledged NATO member with veto power ourselves.
Right.
And apparently, it's either not in the mindset of our politicians at the moment to use their membership in NATO, to the full, or, we are not really accepted there as a full member, but, it's in name only, and we still have to listen to the others, what they tell us, even on issues that directly affect our identity.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. Well, again, that goes back, I think, to, I think I've quoted and written about President Ronald Reagan, one of our greatest presidents of the last century, who, long before he was president, I think it was a speech he gave to the Phoenix Chamber of Commerce, oddly, Phoenix, Arizona, in like 1960, and he said that, and this is pertaining to the issue of freedom, freedom is never more than one generation away from extinction. You're not born with it. It isn't in the blood. You have to pass it down to each successive generation. And I think that's very true of the issue of identity. You can say that Macedonians they're born Macedonian, obviously, but it's still something that identity and everything that goes into it has to be passed on to the next generation, to the children, and they need to be inculcated with what does it mean to be a Macedonian and all that goes into it, the history and the culture and the language and just all of that stuff has to be constantly cultivated in the garden, so to speak. Otherwise, it dies out. I mean, there are no Carthaginians around anymore, are there?
No.
They were wiped out militarily by the Romans and then subsumed into Roman culture, etc. But their identity, I think, was weakened over time in a variety of ways. Of course, they famously practiced child sacrifice. But my point is that you really got to cultivate identity, and you've got this assault coming from, well, certainly the Albanians in Macedonia, but then from the international institutions. So you don't have a choice, though. You just have to keep working on it, supporting it.
Yeah, it's not just. So I mentioned there is now an attempt to, kind of reinforce our maybe religious identity, through this long-running attempt by the regional embassies of the U.S. to have the church recognition as part of the Prespa Treaty and our NATO membership, etc. But there is now, I mean, I can sense it's still not formal, official, but I can sense another growing attempt to court Macedonians, kind of reinforce our identity, but also divert it with the Vancho Mikhailov saga. So now we have all the all the bribed, all the blackmailed VMRO officials who agreed to work with the embassy and therefore are not in Budapest or in prison. We have people like Nikola Todorov, Lipcha Georgievsky, some lesser figures, but who we know that are in contact with the embassy. They're now, after the Vancho Mikhailov situation in Bitola, they're now coming out and saying, listen, we need to endorse him, we need to put him back into our historic, or into our history. He was never fully accepted as a Macedonian historic figure. And this is because, he cooperated with the pro-Nazi Croatian Ustaša regime. He was not allowed by the Bulgarians to come into Macedonia and run the country during the war. They kept direct control of the country. They did not give it to a VMRO figure to run it as a province. But he stayed in Croatia and cooperated with, worked very closely with Pavelic, the Ustaša leader. And he would say that Macedonians are Bulgarians, but while demanding an independent and united Macedonia, and made a short-lived attempt to create a Nazi puppet state as the Germans were all but withdrawing from the Balkans, which would maybe have meant Macedonia remaining independent from Serbia and Bulgaria, but probably not. It would have been a poisoned fruit from a poisoned tree so late in the war, and would probably have failed. So now these guys are coming out and saying, let's endorse him. And then at the same time, they're repeating the comments which are clearly given by the embassy that, in broader interviews, like going back to the war in Ukraine, demanding that we as a country and the conservatives, who are obviously extremely wary of the Americans at the moment, side with the Americans, support the American Ukrainian side, denounce Russia, etc. So, you get the feeling that both these narratives are coming from the same place, from the same embassy, which, as I said, like in the church, they would like to see a Slavic, pro-American, anti-Russian identity develop, even though in this case, around this figure, it would be very little removed from adopting a full Bulgarian identity. And also it would be, it would be actually built around the Nazi figure. But I guess the US sees that the Bandera thing is working out pretty well for them in Ukraine. So they see an interesting blueprint, even though Bandera obviously fought the Russians. And Vancho Mikhailov and other right-wing leaders of the VMRO, they would kill socialists, they would kill communist infiltrators, agents in the region. there was a lot of infighting in VMRO between the left and the right wings. So now the US, but not actual Russians, only people who had some ties to Russia at the time. But the US thinks, okay, and some of their minions here, who they maintain on the right, are saying this, that we need to try to project this feud in VMRO from the 1920s, 1930s between the left and the right wing into hating Russia, because the left were obviously the Russian agents or supported by Russia. And if we can build some identity around this, I think they would let us, play around with historic figures again and go back to some sense of national pride and, flags and coats of arms and historic heroes, even though until, for years, the US has been absolutely banning us from celebrating historic figures and microdosing who we can celebrate, to what extent, in what way, who do we give to the Greeks, who do we give to the Bulgarians. But now we see people who are, coming directly from the embassy saying, okay, let's go full right-wing, slightly Nazi VMRO leadership from the 1920s and 1930s. I mean, it's really interesting. They're the latest twist in the embassy kitchen, what they're cooking up.
Well, my advice as an American who loves Macedonia is to the extent that you can do it, ignore the embassy. Tell them to bugger off if you have a choice, if you have an opportunity.
They control everything at the moment.
Well, I'll push back gently on that. I mean, you go through what is it? Outside of Skopje, you're leaving Kislavoda on your way to Sopiste. You go to Pripor. I think it's Pripor, the little village town there. And then in Pripor and then the Sopiste, there's Macedonian flags all over. And then into Sonja Gorna, Macedonian flags all over the Star of Kutlesh, all over the place, etc. So, and this goes back to something that I remember when I was there in January, talking to a couple of friends. I asked them, "What do you feel? Do you feel depressed, angry, sad about everything that's going on in terms of those that are attacking Macedonia?" And they said, "No, actually, just the opposite. We feel quite. We feel good." I think is what they said, or something like that. But the gist of their argument was that because of all of these attacks, more and more Macedonians, especially young Macedonians, are actually learning about Macedonian culture and history and the language and everything else. Because when something is under attack, and if it means anything to you, you want to protect it, you want to preserve it, and that also means learning more about it and celebrating it. And so I like what they said, and I like their approach, and I think that is the more that Macedonian identity is under attack, the more that Macedonians will come to embrace it and promote it, and U.S. Embassy on Kali be damned. So we'll see. Anyway, what else we got to talk about? I got a farmer's pick. I'd say we're at about 43 minutes, I think, 42, something like that. So I should mention this is episode number 137 of the Macedonian Content Farmers Podcast. Should we do a farmer's pick?
Yeah, sure, if you have one.
All right. I got one. Yeah, I peruse the interwebs daily for stuff about Macedonia, and every now and then I find one of these weird little unique blog posts, I guess, from somebody. This one is a Polish couple. And their website is bluephoto.pl, and I think this was last year, but it's in Polish, but you can do the Google Translate automatic. It says May Adventure Macedonia ! And apparently they've got a 4x4 Toyota Hilux, and they took it and they just drove all over Macedonia, and they've got pictures, videos, a video on YouTube, and then of course they talk about all the places they go, and they've got an approach starting out from Poland and down to Skopje, and then let's see, Matka, Tetovo, Mavrovo National Park. And they do all the places. They go to Kruševo and Ohrid and Bitola and all around the country. It's a very long blog post, if we can call it that, with lots of photos. But it's just great to see that this Polish couple decides they want to come down. And of course, they don't mention the N-word anywhere, which is why I'm promoting it. But it's just a good reminder, great pictures for those thinking of summer's coming up, for those Macedonians thinking of a staycation, of staying in Macedonia this summer instead of going somewhere else. Good to be reminded of all these wonderful, beautiful, incredibly unique places in Macedonia that foreigners and Macedonians can go to enjoy. And I find myself just kind of scrolling through these pictures thinking, gosh, memories flood back into my mind of all the places, all the times I've been in these places that this Polish couple is showing. So anyway, it's May Adventure Macedonia on bluephoto.pl. We'll put that in the show notes.
Great. We love the Poles.
Yes, absolutely. So I'll make sure that some of my Polish Macedonian friends hear that. All right. Well, I think that's a full wrap.
Yeah, till the next episode.
Absolutely. Great talking to you, buddy.
You too, buddy. Take care.